Thank you all so much for being with us today. I have to say, I have been looking forward to this conversation for a really long time, and I'm so thrilled that we were able to make it happen. And I'm so grateful to the team at Projects by If. And just amazing. I'm really excited for this conversation. So I'm Paula Goldman. I'm the Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce. And in my role, I have the privilege of guiding the design, development, and deployment of Salesforce technologies with ethics and accessibility, and perhaps most importantly, trust at the core. Although I would say they're all very, very, very important. I'm incredibly excited about the event we have today. So let's take a moment to look at our agenda, which I think I just saw flash on the screen. We'll start out with some projects from myself, or some remarks from myself, and from the singular Sarah Gold, founder and CEO of Projects by If. And then we'll welcome an amazing panel of mindful friction practitioners, and we'll have time for audience questions. After the webinar, we're hosting an invite-only workshop to discuss case studies in more depth. So if you're staying on for that, just a housekeeping reminder, please don't forget to sign on to the next Zoom link. And as a final reminder, we are recording today's webinar panel. So let's dive in. And I suppose we should start with a quick definition of what we mean when we say mindful friction. And the core of this is that friction can be seen as a negative, and in some cases it can be a negative, but we want to flip that on its head. So in this case, mindful friction means thoughtfully interrupting usual processes of completing a task to encourage reflection and intentionality, which we believe is very necessary as we think about AI systems and how they operate. So at Salesforce, our responsible AI and tech team is working across product design and engineering to build more mindful friction into our AI products. It means things like implementing system-wide controls and product design that create pauses in the user experience, not only to ensure intentional engagement from humans at critical junctures where judgment might be most needed, but also allowing aggregate level reviews, granular level reviews where most needed, to act upon AI generated content and recommendations and support trustworthy AI. So just one example of this, across our generative AI suite, we've been very intentional about button valence. What does this mean? So across our cloud products and our AI products, the buttons for things like review or send are the same color. Review or accept, same color and font, so that we're not sort of subtly encouraging people accidentally not to review something that they may need to review. It's that kind of thing. That's just one example of mindful friction in action. And we're going to be publishing more examples later this week on our newsroom post for anyone that's interested in learning more. But the point of this is to learn from all of you. And so I'm really excited to pass the mic to Sarah to lead us through this panel. And Sarah, thank you for your leadership on this and so many other topics. And I'm just really excited for the conversation and the partnership. So please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paula. Nice to meet you all. As Paula says, I am the founder and CEO of Projects by If. At If, we are a design and strategy firm. We're based in London, which is where I'm talking to you all from now, but we operate globally. And we work with really influential organisations such as, I'll name a few, TikTok, Government Digital Service, or Lloyds Bank, on the core kind of product, policy, and technology challenges that really define their trustworthiness. And we help them to build products, services, and strategies, and really great, trustworthy experiences. And the past 10 years have been about moving from transactions to user experience. We think the next shift, the shift we're in now, is about moving from experience to trust. Trust is the new experience, as we like to say at If. And as an industry, I think we're gradually seeing the rhetoric of friction in experiences change from being bad to being considered as good, essential even. And I think there are lots of different reasons for this, but a big driver is that it's harder than ever before to know who or what to trust. Am I interacting with an AI or a human? I can confirm Paula and I are not deep fakes right now. You know, was that email that I just received really from my bank? Is this result fair? And we need friction to understand the tools that we use, their benefits, but also limitations too. And particularly in an enterprise context, this is really important for adoption, trust, and safety, as Paula outlined. And I think that with generative AI models, it's getting even harder and more important because generative AI are machine learning models that can generate content that before was really, or up until this point in history, the kind of content that only humans could make. That might include text, images, videos, audio. And they do this essentially through autocomplete. So they predict the next part of a sequence. And this leads to lots of complicated, but also potentially useful outputs. And we're starting to see applications of generative models, especially multiple generative models tuned to fulfill one user experience. So we're headed into the thick of the complexity here. And to help us unpack that today and why friction is so important in that environment, I want to invite our three panelists to join us. So if you'd all like to come on, and we've got about 30 minutes all together to unpack this topic of mindful friction in generative AI experiences with this kind of emphasis on the enterprise context. And our panelists here, welcome, nice to see you. Are here to have like an open conversation as much as they can do. And we do have time for an audience Q&A towards the end. So please do write in with any questions that you have to the panel using the tool in Zoom, and Paula will pick those up towards the end. So I'm just going to introduce our incredible panelists for the day. We've got Sharon Lowe. Sharon is a product lead at GitHub Copilot. She's really driving the next wave of AI native experiences for developers. And before GitHub, she was on a team called Ethics and Society at Microsoft, where she launched over 20 emerging AI products, such as synthetic speech to early large language models, really focusing on how do you mitigate harm and defining AI ethics too. Alex, hey Alex. Alex Norton is a product manager at Google DeepMind, where he's looking at the potential of kind of emerging AI research through a people-centered approach to responsible innovation. And he's a co-founder of Google's People and AI Guidebook, which I love. If you've not seen it, do check it out. And prior to this, he led design at Google Travel for kind of AI-powered trip planning. And last but not least, we have Jessica Watson. Jessica's co-founder and chief product officer at the US Digital Response, or USDR. I might interchange between those two. They are a nonprofit that helps governments, nonprofits, and public entities respond really quickly to critical public needs. And prior to USDR, Jessica was a product design director at Facebook, part of Meta, leading the Facebook app monetization design team. So welcome. It's so great to have you with us. So let's get into this conversation of how mindful friction can help AI-enabled products and services that people want to use, organizations want to adopt. And so I'd love to kick us off with Sharon, if you could speak to how friction in AI is manifesting in your work at GitHub and how you're approaching it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. One, just like super happy to be here. But I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about like what exactly I work on at GitHub Copilot, and then kind of give a little bit more color in terms of where the friction applies. So on Copilot specifically, I lead the product area around extensibility. And so you might have heard that as a buzzword, extensibility and agents, but the analogy I like to use is in a lot of, tools like ChatGPT or Gemini, you're talking to one generalized assistant. And in the world of extensibility, multi-agents, we see a world where you start to bring in experts. So imagine you can bring in an expert in healthcare into the conversation, or an expert in policy into the conversation, and you start having a multi-agent discussion. And so that's the space for Copilot, is this vision of transforming Copilot, not just from a product, but in an entire platform that supports these agents. So imagine you're a developer working with the Stripe API, and you can actually talk with a Stripe agent that queries the Stripe agent for the documentation around Stripe, execute workflows, perform tasks, and things like that. So in this new world, friction is very top of mind for me in terms of a couple things. Number one is understanding, how do you help someone understand what that agent is an expert in? And I think it's not too different from, you entering a conference in a room full of strangers. And when you meet someone, how do you get to know what their strengths are and what to ask them and what not to ask them and what to rely on them for? And so how does friction actually start to set up that understanding? And then number two is as we start to get into, orchestration or even automation of tasks, I think friction starts to become really, really important. Is how do you have the user actually start to steer the agent in the direction that they have control in? How do they know what task is being executed? Is it executing the way they want to? How do they have confirmations if the task is executed in the way that's correct to them? And so these are all ways that we're also thinking about this next. I feel like generative AI is already moving so fast, but this next wave of generative AI already is where friction comes into play there. So yeah.
I really like what you're saying there about friction as being part of that kind of, it's in the name GitHub Copilot, but the Copilot piece, how do we make sure that people are able to understand the limitations, consequences, applications of these technologies through these moments where we can intentionally add something that just makes them think differently about what they're seeing. So I think that was I'd love to get into that a bit more in some of the questions, and but I'm going to turn to you, Jessica, to just kind of build on that in your context. What ways is this kind of problem manifesting in your work, and how might you be using friction to solve those challenges?
Sure. And well, first, thank you so much for having me here today. And just to provide a little context for everyone, as the org I work with is slightly different than GitHub or Google. We provide technical capacity to governments around the United States. And so primarily we work with state and local governments who are at a very different digital maturity than the larger tech organizations that we're used to dealing with in this context. And we generally work with governments to solve the problems that are top of mind for them today. And today, generally, a lot of it has been around AI. They hear the buzzword from their governors, from their mayors. They know there's something they should be doing with it. They also hear that it could be scary and are trying to figure out how to navigate AI, and also leverage the benefits that it can bring to both their communities and to their workforce, and making things easier for them to do. But trust is such a huge part, especially in the government context, right? If people lose trust in government and government's ability to serve them and meet them where they are to meet their critical needs, we're not just talking about losing trust in a product, but this is potentially losing trust in democracy. And so we really have to think about how we support our governments in a really meaningful way. The bar as to what is good AI has not been collectively decided. And so we're working to help partners across the country start to define that. But while there is friction in the user interface between the users and AI that governments are deploying, I think a lot of the friction we're actually adding in some ways is in the process of development of Gen AI tools themselves, to ensure that they are thinking about how they deploy them in a meaningful way. And so just one example I'll share is we've been working on a project to help limited English proficiency Spanish speakers better access unemployment insurance. And so we've been building a large language model to help with translations of the very jargony and complex unemployment insurance language so that folks can be more successful in applying for unemployment insurance. What this has meant, though, is really we've started with user research to build the language model from the get-go, because there are huge implications if we get this wrong. Just one example I'll share more in the implication side is in English, we have the concept of being laid off or fired from a job. And those have very different implications as to whether or not you are eligible for unemployment insurance. In Spanish, there's just laid off. There is not a it's not distinguished between the two. And so we have to be able to ensure that we are translating it in the right way so folks can answer in the appropriate manner to ensure that they're eligible. And so a lot of our work, as I'm saying, is really how do we make sure that what we're deploying is right? Because for a lot of it, we can't rely on the end user to make we don't want them to make the wrong decision. So that's just a little context on how it's a little different, but also we're going to be looking to the private sector really on how friction is brought in to help drive the norms that we're able to leverage to make this process even easier for people.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I mean, if we sometimes talk about how we can't shift the complexity of decision making or the responsibility of decision making solely to your end user, whether that be a colleague, a caseworker, a consumer, or a citizen, this complexity needs to be dealt with earlier on. So that answer really resonates with me. And what you were talking about in terms of applying friction in the process, Alex, I'm going to turn to you to talk a little bit about what this means, particularly within product and design, when we're thinking about this shift of, what does good friction mean when we're working with pixels to now? What does that kind of mindful friction when we're working with models mean? I'd love to just hear about what you've been thinking of.
Sure, and so grateful to be here and grateful to be able to go third here. So I get to kind of like hear the perspectives of both Jessica and Sharon. I think those inform my point of view here. Something to be said about the system, there's something to be said about the people. As Sharon was alluding to, the generative AI revolution's here, but the next thing we're sort of curious about is this agent revolution. Is you can think about generative AI as the ability to, produce an output. You have some text, it either goes to an image, to other text, but these agents, what do these agents do? They integrate these generative models with traditional systems using this thing we call tool use. So all of a sudden, it's not just an input-output, it's, what about all this asynchronous stuff that can happen? What about all these processes that can happen in the background? How do we make sense of that? The reason I bring up that context is when I think about pixels and I think about these models, they're all, historically, when we designed interfaces, they would be very deterministic. You'd have a page that always rendered the same way. You'd have different content on it, but it would have a very deterministic structure. You could set expectations from a user point of view with what was going to happen. These agents, when they can operate asynchronously, we have to think about how much of that process should we disclose to users? Not just how do we calibrate trust with the system, but how do we calibrate users' understanding of what's happening? We have this principle in our AI guidebook that our explanation shouldn't try to be complete, but they should try to help the users make sense of the system. Meet the users where they're at. We explain the process that's happening, use the right level of technical sophistication so that the user can build their own mental model of what's happening. So I think it's really incumbent upon designers, upon practitioners in the space to, as Jessica was saying, do this user research, understand who are your users, what is their familiarity with this technology. And when we're going to introduce friction, because an explanation is friction, when we're going to introduce how is the system reasoning its way through a problem, what tools and services is it using, you're asking for attention from the user. You're asking the user to participate in the sense-making experience. That's a new system, I think, that our users and our people need to make sense of. Now, I'll try to wrap it up, but quickly, I think something I was really curious that Jessica was getting to is the people side of things. Not even the explaining to users, but my goodness, how do we all work together? At DeepMind, we have product folks, we've got researchers, we have AI ethicists, we've got designers. We all speak a really different language. It's totally different vernaculars. So I'll leave this with the provocation. I think something we need to articulate our shared goals because it can be really difficult.
Really, really nice points there. And I think that idea of mindful friction as being part of that sense-making experience really resonated with me. Like I see Sharon's nodding there too. Like working out where and why to add friction and what's just enough absolutely comes back to this point of like, what are the user needs? And my next question is really about like, what are the like really useful integrations of generative AI for in particular enterprise users? So when we think about folks who are in that kind of enterprise context space, where are we seeing the kind of useful use cases for generative AI? So not necessarily chatbots all the time, just going to say it. And how does friction play a role in those being successful? And Jessica, would you like to kick us off with some of your reflections on that?
Sure, and I'll speak to the domain I'm in, public sector. One of the areas we've been working in is for any benefits, public benefits that exist. There's a process where folks are able to appeal a decision made on whether they're available or not, or whether they're eligible or not, I'm sorry. And there's a lot of appeals and there are a few people making the decisions, and there's a huge opportunity for both automation and also leveraging AI to help alleviate and expedite this process. One of the things we've been able to do, I think, and that I really appreciate in some of the prototypes that we've been building with our team is, we've built a model based on all of the case law that exists within specific benefits to be able to leverage that in decision making. And we've also built a UI layer on top of the model to ensure that we're able to pull in the right structured data to reduce the potential error in prompt writing. So folks are able to be really successful in getting the info that they need. But we actually aren't using the LLM to make the decision. Because there needs to be a human in the loop. Where this is helping in the process is the examiner has already made a decision, but what we're able to do is help pull in the appropriate case law as for citations in their decision and write the decision letter to the end user. And we've seen where every case examiner is doing this in a different way. There's not a ton of consistency. This is now starting to bring consistency to the process, can ensure that there's more consistency in how they're citing decisions. And so I just get excited about these cases where we're able to leverage this technology, where success doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to go into a prompt and figure it out, but that we're able to bring the technology to them in a way that really makes a ton of sense. And I think this goes back to some of what Alex was saying and really getting alignment early on what success is, right? And what from everyone, what success looks like, what are the right outcomes we're trying to achieve, when does it make sense to have friction, when does it not? This is probably going to be a theme that comes again and again, and that's because AI isn't any different than developing any other product in that sense, right? We all need to approach it from that same level of thoughtfulness. So that's where I'm getting excited in some of the work we're doing here, but I'm really excited to hear from Alex and Sharon.
Brilliant. I mean, I was going to ask Sharon if you wanted to build on that, in particular when we think about, well, I'm going to let you build on it, actually. I'm just going to let you.
Love it. Yeah, I feel like, I work in the development space, but I would say, talking to friends in the AI space, I feel like it's less about the specific type of integration that enterprises are curious about, but more I see a common pattern from every enterprise trying to use generative AI, which is number one, generative AI is generalized, right? It's generalized for the average user. It's not customized for that enterprise's context around their organization, their best practices, their standards, their culture, their data. And I think being able to tune or actually have a generalized AI be fit for purpose for an enterprise, I think that transformation is often what I see as the toughest challenge. And that's a question I often get is how do I customize this, model to our company? And so we work through a lot of different types of customization options from like fine tuning to custom instructions, but that's kind of a common pattern I see. And I think Friction can do an amazing job of, one, being able to teach how do you customize something, but how do you set expectations around customization? As Alex was pointing out, AI is non-deterministic. And I think that is something that is also very hard for organizations to fully grasp. Like, hey, if I want this entire AI to follow this security standard practice, it doesn't mean it always will, right? And how do you sell that to enterprises in a way that's not extremely daunting? It's challenging. And so I think that's one thing of how do you set expectations around what customization can do through Friction, through teaching, through feedback loops and stuff like that. But also I think, common patterns we also see around adoption blockers, besides not the fact that AI is non-deterministic, is just the lack of interpretability and alignment with AI. Like, how do I know how this AI arrived at its answer? How do I know if I can trust it? How do I know what's the confidence they have in this answer? And so on Copilot, we do as much as we can to inform every suggestion in terms of how it arrived at its answer. What context is it using? So we actually show, this is the code snippet that it referenced, or this is the file or that we use to be able to inform its answer to kind of build trust around that. Also, I think, Jessica also mentioned this, top of mind is a lot of, concerns around privacy and security. How do I make sure that, the data I'm using to customize this model isn't actually, being used to train the AI model? How do I make sure I'm not accidentally stepping on, IP infringement? And so there's a lot of work that we do on Copilot also of, how do we make sure, so anytime, for example, we've indexed actually the entire GitHub repository to fact check, like anytime we're actually serving a suggestion that it doesn't match another suggestion that exists. And if it does, we'll actually show a match. So how do we give admins and organizations more control around, data provenance, governance, auditing, and things like that? So that's my initial spiel, but I would love to hear, Alex, your thoughts.
I think that's brilliant. And just to build on that, kind of what we're talking about is what are the more human-centered patterns or like repeatable solutions to common problems that we're finding as we integrate this technology. And earlier this year, we published at IF sort of 16 new patterns to our design pattern catalogue, all around how to really earn trustworthiness with these AI systems. So I do encourage those of you who are listening in to have a look at catalog.projectsbyif and just check those out, because Sharon, so many of the things you were just mentioning, I was like, oh yeah, that was a pattern. That was something you referenced. So, and Alex, I'd love you to kind of build on this, particularly the kind of idea that prompt, or the suggestion in the room, that prompt engineering, I know you've got some interesting views on this, is not necessarily a good outcome for these kinds of systems and how they work with people. So yeah, take us away.
Oh yeah, that's kind of a spicy take. Prompt engineering is evidence of an unoptimized system. I mean, we've seen entire job role profiles pop up around this. Like, people are making way up in the six figures to do prompt engineering. We've seen so many different podcasts and catalogs and how-to guides for how to model to stop. Introduce some friction into that autoregressive process. Stop and think before you speak. It's fascinating because the way that we talk to these models, it's almost like the way we talk to people. And these models are often trained on language, so it's intuitive that they would have similar behaviors as people. But one of my beliefs here is that we shouldn't have to be so explicit with all this scaffolding that we put into place to get systems to behave in the way we expect. I mean, when was the last time you had to persuade your phone to respond to a message for you? When was the last time you had to emotionally manipulate your TV to turn on? I mean, do these things, the systems just work the way that we expect them to. Like, for instance, my Wi-Fi right now decides to keep changing between networks. Like, this is ridiculous. Even our existing systems are somewhat unoptimized. But when it comes to these agent systems, these LMs, something that I'm really curious about is, what are the new abstractions going to be that help people to make sense of the way that these systems behave? So it shouldn't necessarily be prompt engineering, but perhaps it could be interpretability, as has been said a couple times before. As Sharon was saying, how does the system cite its sources appropriately? Or how do we build the affordances so that people, okay, so the audio's still coming in. How do we build the right UX affordances so people can feel like they're trusting the system without having to go through the extreme cognitive load of writing paragraph level prompts to get the systems to behave appropriately? So I think there's a lot of active research here. And I'm curious to just see in the next months, the next years, how we're going to simplify the system. It sort of makes me think back to in the early 21st century when we had to dial up onto the internet. You had to go through this complicated process of using this dial-up modem. You couldn't talk on the phone during it. In some ways, that's sort of what it feels like to do prompt engineering, to work with these LLMs today. There's all this scaffolding and process, which hopefully better procedures, better policies, and better guidelines help us to alleviate in the future.
Thank you. And I'm going to move us on to next series of sort of questions around how we're really like selling friction to the organizations that we're working for and with. How do we get organizations to prioritize this? So as you've already mentioned, Sharon, the speed of pace in AI development has been, I mean, I've not been able to keep up. I think everyone feels, I imagine, that they want a break from it. We're definitely on that hype cycle. I think we're possibly going through that trough of disillusionment. You know, we've seen quite a few press releases of, you know, negative press stories about some of the kind of AI products and services that have come out. That means we're soon going to head into that like slope of enlightenment if we follow that kind of hype cycle exactly. And I think that friction is going to play a really big role in the kinds of products and services that we see in that kind of enlightenment stage. So the work that you three are doing in terms of helping and encouraging your organizations and colleagues and partners to look at friction, I think is really important. So I'd love to turn to you, Jessica, to speak a little bit about, and you've already touched on this a bit actually in your previous answer, but you know, how are you selling mindful friction within your organization setting? And obviously it's your organization and the organizations you're trying to influence too. How do you get folks to prioritize it when, as you've mentioned already, AI to begin with, it's a bit of a buzzword to start off with?
Yeah. Well, I'm not selling it as mindful friction, I think is part of it. That's not the way it's happening and it goes back, this is maybe very simplistic, but it comes back to really aligning on outcomes, being really clear on the problem that we're trying to solve, how we know we're solving the problem, and then understanding when and if mindful friction is the right solution to help us get us closer to the outcome, really is what it is. And so I believe it's a tool like any other thing we would implement to help us get closer to the outcome we want. And I am coming from the less technical side, so all of this is like product designery, like this feels very easy to me, but I do think there is a lot of like getting to alignment on what we're trying to do and what success looks like. And some of this comes from my background, having worked on consumer ad products. We had built a product where it was a way for businesses to collect email addresses, having a platform where we already have your email address. You could imagine there was a way to do this very easily, right? Someone could just hit a button, you submit your email address, and you're on and with your day. But what we found through research was that actually folks weren't doing it intentionally, right? They were just hitting a button and then they'd get an email in their inbox later and not remember why they were getting it. And businesses were now getting a list of emails that weren't useful to them. And so we added friction into that process. And while it really did help us align on that ultimate outcome, was ensuring business outcomes and outcomes that folks were happy with, and that they got an email that meant something to them, and that friction was required to do that. And so, but that was because we aligned on what the outcome was and not just that it was the number of submissions of email addresses. And so I think there's a lot of similar approaches that we need to take in this work, even though it is harder to ultimately, it's not as deterministic to get to the outcome. I think that alignment is really important to then be able to make the argument for when friction makes sense.
And Sharon, at GitHub, where you're looking at, you know, the business using friction in the way that you're developing your developer products, what are you hearing from your users, from developers or from CTOs who are using your tools in terms of why friction matters in terms of their adoption or potentially trustworthiness of the kinds of tooling that you're making?
Yeah, it's kind of like two-pronged, because I feel like friction, when you mention that word, I think a lot of like users and product teams, especially kind of just like they hesitate because they're like, oh, like, you know, the idea of a seamless user experience is what's sold for so long. And the idea of having for the user to exert effort is scary. And it's, I think a lot of product teams start getting scared of like, this is going to impact our engagement in some way. And so I think there are a lot of things of, I see friction more as like, how do we help the user be successful in what they need to do? You know, is it about setting understanding? If so, friction helps them educate them around the feature. Is it about them having awareness of how the product is working in certain, you know, what's in certain states or certain areas? Is it about actually having control and agency when things go wrong or even when things go right? And how do you direct the product to do what you want it to do? And so I think that's how I try to, like, I think friction for me is more of like a symptom or an outcome. I think the need from users is more around control and agency. And so how do you focus on what the user need is and sell that to product teams and leadership? But it's a tough one. I think this is like the hardest challenge is like trustworthy experiences. Sometimes, you know, as I mentioned, I was in the ethics and society space. For a lot of teams, this is like a nice to have. Like it gets down to like a P4 when we're prioritizing the cut lines. And oftentimes, as Sarah, you were saying, like the way I've been also talking about it is that this will be the determinator and differentiator, I think, for products as we go forward. And that's something, a vision I keep telling leadership. Like the other day, for example, I was just driving and my blind spot detection was on. And because of that, I like avoided merging. And I'm like, I'm so glad this feature exists. And I always tell product teams and leadership, like, this is what we want to do around our experiences. Like we have the right, you know, safety features in place where users are really glad that they exist and they're there. And I think that as AI becomes like this next wave of more generation, like more this new generation of AI, these things are only going to become more and more important. So yeah.
And absolutely, and I'm gonna, this leads us in really nicely to my the next question I'm so curious to ask you all. So Alex, I'm going to turn to you, which is, I think, you know, Sharon, you lined up some of these answers really nicely. So, but like, how do we measure that friction's actually working and who is it working for? I think that some of what you were touching on there, Sharon and Jessica, you're both saying is ultimately has to work for the people we're trying to serve, those end users, who in the context of enterprises might be those colleagues or individuals internally, but also the people that they then serve after that. So, but yeah, how do we start to measure that friction's working and link that into the goals that, you know, businesses are interested in? So Alex, love to hear your thoughts on that one.
I will hope that my Wi-Fi has improved. Maybe it hasn't, but we're gonna go for it. So give me disappointed faces if it's really bad.
Okay.
I think when I think about how we're integrating measurement here, I'm gonna go for a more of a consumer-oriented approach. So I'm sure y'all have used YouTube before. One of the most infamous algorithms in the world is the YouTube Watch Next algorithm. The YouTube Watch Next algorithm means you watch a video and then whatever plays next is informed by a bunch of sophisticated recommendations. I think one of the areas to think about with friction is how do we help users in this kind of a space, a consumption or an entertainment space, break out beyond just seeing whatever comes next. For instance, lots of people use YouTube for education, to learn more, to upskill. How can we help people specify these kind of goals? Sort of back to what Sharon was saying, it isn't just about helping people to be entertained or consume content, but how do you help them to operationalize an outcome? How do you introduce friction in this process so they can specify, hey, I would like to learn more about this topic area. I would like to upskill on this particular skill. So I just am sharing this because this is an area of active research that we're curious about. Now, on one side, we have optimizing for user engagement and watch time. On the other side, we have optimizing for more of the long-term value of users. What would motivate them to participate in this product over time, to build a durable relationship with this platform, to not just waste hours and hours scrolling or looking at content?
It kind of links slightly. I'm going to go, Jessica, if you've got some builds on how you might measure how friction works or not in the context, as you mentioned at the beginning, that's kind of different to organizations that operate under kind of commercial purposes. You were talking earlier about really big themes about truth and democracy. So yeah, how might you measure that friction's working?
Yeah. I mean, I think it still gets to being really clear on the use case and problem that we're trying to solve. That is, at the end of the day, like if a person comes to a site to submit an unemployment application and they're not successful in that, that is where the trust is or isn't broken. And so we want to ensure that we're really clear on their ability to do that there. But I think we do have to, there are different ways of measuring it, right? Like you can say, our goal with implementing this LLM here is to increase the number of applications submitted. But that doesn't actually take into account they get submitted, but does that actually mean that they were able to get and were successful in getting unemployment insurance? So then we actually need to look a little bit deeper, right? Like actually, we want to make sure that folks are successful in completing an application and are getting the right outcome that they were assuming. But I think what is tricky here is you still have to have like some countermetrics too, right? I think if we were to say LLM has helped us and more people are successful, but we're getting less applications through, or it's taking folks more time, I don't think we'd say, wow, this was a, woo, ship it, this is amazing. Like we still want to make sure that we're saving time, we're making the process easier, and they're also able, but the most important thing is going to be that they were successful in doing the thing that they tried to do in the first place. So it's just, I think, coming back to being really clear on what success is and focusing there, and then having those hard conversations on what are the trade-offs we're willing to make.
Thank you so much. I wish I could ask you so many more questions. I've just absolutely loved being able to, learn more about your work. Now, though, it's time for us to turn to our Q&A from folks who have joined us online. So it's your turn. We have some questions, and Paula is coming online to take this part. So over to you, Paula.
Yeah, that was really a great conversation. And there's some great questions in the Q&A function. So I encourage you all to take a look, including there's one about resources, and then people are already answering some questions about resources and sharing some really great stuff that I was able to check out. So do take a look. Here's the first one, the first question I want to pose to all of you. Are you finding that designing mindful friction into AI experiences is changing the mix of skills that you need in product teams? And I might expand like engineering teams or design teams or whatnot. Do we need different skills for this?
I could jump in. I
Please.
think something that I'm noticing, and I sit a bit more on the research side, so less in instantiating products and more in thinking about what are the root node capabilities these systems need to enable sort of more generalized reasoning. And we're finding that we're historically, as a designer, you would really need to have a lot of sensitivity for aesthetics, accessibility in terms of like UIs. We're now thinking more about like cognitive accessibility or cultural accessibility. And for these reasons, we need more people with a deep background in psychology or cognitive science, anthropology, like how do we understand cultures and how they vary more? Because we're putting these values in these systems. These systems often come from a Western-centric point of view, and they end up serving folks in other parts of the world. So I would advocate for more of that kind of capability.
Yeah,
I
I
as
totally.
an anthropologist. Go ahead.
No, I totally plus one what Alex said, just because we're establishing mental models and new paradigms. So I think having that background and skill set is super important. But I think anyone that can, I think oftentimes, an underrated skill that isn't broad enough is content design. How do, writers really help educate users throughout this entire process? And oftentimes at least in the private sector, I see teams kind of like haphazard the written content versus like the visual aesthetics. And I've worked with some great content designers, and I've seen it make a world of a difference when that skill is brought in as well.
That's super helpful. And I was just gonna plus one the earlier comment also about cognitive science. I was just thinking a lot about the question of if as we typically talked about, we automate sort of the less high judgment issues, and then we leave to people only high judgment issues. Like, what does that mean for cognitive burden? There's a whole bunch of questions to think through in that regard. Let's move to a second question. So forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this name, I believe it's Kuba, is asking, it strikes me that friction can do a few things. It can put users in control, but it can also shift burden over quality of the experience away from the service provider. It's the tech, or it's on you to figure out if we're lying. So how do we do one without the other?
I mean, I'm happy to try to chime in here. I mean, it's a really tricky question. It's one of those questions. It's like it sounds simple, but it's got deep roots. I think the biggest word that comes to mind for me is context. It's like, what is the context of the situation? What is the stakes of a decision at play? And the real answer is, I think it depends. And this just comes down to really understanding your users, your context. Am I looking at a person who uses the system every day, 50 times a day? Are they an expert? Is this like, maybe to some of Jessica's points, is this like a one-time, very high stakes operation? In that case, how do I put in friction in such a way that the user is really understanding the weight and the gravity of these decisions? If a system is providing defaults, like here's what I think based on what I know about you, the default state, can it rationalize that in a way that helps the user understand what's happening? I would say it comes back to it depends, and you just have to pay attention.
Yeah, I would also leverage what Jessica's been really emphasizing throughout this panel, which is like focusing on outcomes. And so an outcome that I tend to always keep in mind is, at the end of the day, does the user feel comfortable taking accountability for whatever task they used AI to accomplish? And so whether that be an answer or something. And so I think that balance between, burden over quality, I think that will change, as Alex was mentioning. But if at the end of the day, do they feel comfortable taking that accountability? Do they feel confident they know what led them there? If people ask questions, are they able to like actually answer that? So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, one last question before we wrap up. So, Kirsten is asking, even when asked to cite its sources and express how it arrived at an answer, etc., generative AI will still hallucinate and make stuff up. So how do we manage this when building for transparency and trustworthiness?
I feel like
And also, I'm told we have time for one more question, so we were going to have a surprise question in there.
I'm happy to go first since Alex has been taking the hot seat for the first couple ones. I think the way that we see referencing and context, I think that was it Kirsten, you're absolutely right. Like references can be hallucinated, but I think there's work that we can do to cross-check those references or even lead users. I think what a lot of people do right now, for example, is like they'll actually like have links to the references for you to, as a user, to go ahead and like check those for real. But we all know that likely a user is not going to go ahead and check all those 5 links and do that direct check. But that is actually technology that we can do that doesn't even really involve AI at all, right? Like we can actually look at the response, we can go to those links, we can do a match and see how much of a match are we seeing between this response and these suggestions. So I think there's a lot of innovative ways that we can do to be able to address these hallucinations. While also, I think, again, how do we teach users that they shouldn't be expecting deterministic answers in a non-deterministic system? I think that's the biggest expectation that's always like hard to set. But yeah.
I feel like I've got to piggyback right on this one because I love it. It's such a friction question. Like, I'm going to dive a little bit into the technical details here. When we think about hallucinations, factuality, grounding, all these words, these LMs, they do this big process where they generate an output. But then we can chain together multiple processes. We can say, well, now that you've got that output, now another system can go and check that against, Google search. We can say, does this website exist? You can see, is that true or not true? And you could keep recursively checking these things all the way up and down the output. But this introduces friction. So it's one of these trade-offs. Like, are you willing to wait 5 to 10 seconds for a response? Or kind of to Sharon's point, do I want to put that, or Jessica's point too, do I want to put that burden on the user? Do I want to go back and say, hey, like I gave you the response in 100 milliseconds. There it is. Do your best to, use your own, decision-making power to say, is that correct? And if not, investigate it. these are the real trade-offs that we talk about on search all the time, because latency is really important, but so is factuality.
Yeah. And if I could add one more thing, I think also creating multiple paths, right? Because like, as Alex said, every user is different. Some will say, I'm fine taking these answers as is, or some will be like, no, I actually want that extra validation because of my use case. So how do you introduce multiple pathways in your user experiences as well? And Jessica, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, I was actually gonna just ask a quick question, because it's just, have you seen, or what are the best examples you've seen of communicating that this is a non-deterministic answer to people? Like, that is a huge mental model for folks to get over, that I can enter something and the next time I enter it, I may get a different answer, which is very different from what you expect out of doing a Google search. But in some ways, it still feels like you're doing a search. Like, I'm curious if you have seen good patterns there, or just anyone who's communicating that well.
Got a couple of suggestions off the back of that, which I'm going to just dive in with as Sharon and Alex think of them. Two that I really enjoy are something called, the if design pattern catalogue, counterfactual explanations, which is if one input changed, how does that influence your output? And it creates a kind of playful experience. So I do think we're moving from patterns that are transactional, I do this is what happens, and it's consistent, to how do we start to create experiences where people are able to play with the kind of boundaries of how decisions are made. And within each of those patterns, we have examples of where these exist. But that would be the one actually that I'll kick us off with. But counterfactuals, I think, are part of how we help people build better mental models over that non-determinism and begin to ask those kind of critical questions of the kinds of outputs they might be receiving. So that's one suggestion. It gives Sharon and Alex some time to think if they have some other ideas.
I could throw the most boring one of all, because someone has to produce. If Sarah's giving us the ceiling, someone has to produce the floor. So let me produce, maybe it's even the basement. I mean, sometimes we put disclaimers on things. We say, this is an experimental AI product, right? Like, and then people just read right past it. So now that we've introduced the basement, let's build some framing on top of that. Something I'm very keen on, some of the research we're doing at DeepMind is, again, explainability. How can in a way that's very low friction, how can we explain what are the key factors that are going into producing this result? I considered X, Y, and Z. And I'm not meaning to sidestep this question on determinism, but the point is, if you can help people develop a mental model of like, here are some of the key factors, it's kind of like Sarah's point around counterfactuals. You're helping people to get a bit of more of a sense of what is at play here, so they can reason around what's happening.
I love it, Alex, that you mentioned the basement. I wasn't going to say it, but I'm like, that is indeed very present in every AI product that you use. But I would say also, I think one of the problems with the way that like the transaction systems that are set up today is that people, relate them. They're like, this is just like a Google search. So I'm going to have the same mental model as I do with Google search. And so how do you even break that typical user experience to help users understand that this is an atypical, this is something different? So I actually think recently Perplexity did a pretty cool job of this in their new Copilot Pro thing, where, for example, if you say plan a trip to Tokyo, it's not just going to spit out an answer. It'll actually ask you a dialogue. It'll say, how many days are you going for? Out of these options, what do you like? Do you like food? Do you like sightseeing? And based on some of those factors that you're inputting, I think, Sarah, to your point of like having the user set those guardrails, then it actually starts to give suggestions and answers. And so that's already a different dialogue and experience from a Google search. So hopefully users come in also with a different perception and mindset.
Beautiful. I think as we're seeing throughout this conversation, it's not just one thing. In fact, if you're talking about the mental model of generative AI, it's sort of every piece of this design system should be helping the user understand, why am I getting this outcome? What does it mean? How should I interpret it? From the questions that you ask to constrain the output to the ways that you explain the output, and so on. I'm looking at time. I think we have 5 minutes left. Maybe we can do one lightning round. Okay. So it's like, I'll ask for like a sentence. in response to this. I love that you're focusing on outcomes as KPIs. Are there other success metrics that are top of the priority list when measuring progress? Or maybe ways of measuring outcomes?
Something that we're really interested in is, when you think about the space of education and learning, one of the challenges is you often don't know what you don't know. So like you want to, maybe you're having you're stuck with a syntax error programming, you don't actually understand what the problem is. So one of the KPIs we're excited about is how can the system help you to better understand your needs? Not even the outcome, but can the system help you to ask a better question, to better understand what success could look like? So it sort of foreruns the outcome is, can we align on what the goal should be in the first place?
Love it. Anyone else?
I love that, Alex. I was just thinking, like, how do we measure that? I guess quantitatively. I think because it's a question that we've been asking on Copilot. Like one of the metrics that we look at is, for example, if a user, if we give a suggestion in the editor, does the user accept it or do they actually have to change it? And sometimes I think changing is seen as like a negative outcome, like, oh, we didn't actually give the right answer. But to Alex's point, I think not just giving better answers, but probing the user to ask better questions that would actually have more of an interaction. And so how do we measure that as success? So that was just my PM brain thinking how that would be measured. Personally, I think a lot of, on product teams, we look a lot at like monthly active users and engagement. And then personally, I always look at churn. I think that is something I pay a lot of attention to, which is, how does someone onboard to something, maybe because of hype, and then actually leave the product because it's not meeting the outcomes they're looking for. And so that is a metric that I think is really worth understanding. Like, why are users leaving your product? What about it? And so, yeah.
Amazing. Okay. We have 2 minutes left. I want to say thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation. We heard about friction as sense making. We heard about friction as switching between Wi-Fi networks. I think my insight or my aha was just really thinking about all of it in service of the measuring outcomes for success with customers or end users. And I think there's so much more to do here and so much more for us to adapt to as a field and learn together. Let me turn it back over to Sarah for any last comments here.
Well, just thank you so much, Jessica, Sharon, and Alex. That was awesome. Let's do this again. Please. And for those of you online who are joining the workshops, please do check your email and your calendar invites. You'll see a separate Zoom link that we're going to join any moment now. And we'll be sharing a summary of this conversation with everyone along with the recording very soon. And I think my main takeaway from this panel conversation is that this is really an emerging space. No one's got the exact answers yet. Who knows if we ever really will, given that context is clearly queen when it comes to how to deliver this stuff really well. But we need to have more conversations like this as an industry so that we can really make sure that we produce those products and services that are useful to people, help them meet their outcomes, and that ultimately we're able to trust. Thank you so much, everyone. See you soon. Bye for now.